In exactly 46 seconds, Donald Trump pointed across the hearing room at Harrison Ford and ordered him to be removed from Congress. But Ford didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift in his chair. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his leather jacket, pulled out a dull piece of metal the size of a dog tag, and placed it quietly on the polished wood before him. The cameras didn't know what it was, but Trump did. His eyes caught it and narrowed. A hush crept over the room, not quiet, but the kind of hush that builds when everyone forgets how to breathe. Room 309 of the Cannon House office building was live, raw, and locked into a strange gravity. The topic today wasn't new. A budget proposal to cut funding for federal emergency rescue programs. Just another hearing, another day, but it didn't feel that way. Not today. Something was pulsing under the surface. Not tension, something older. Resentment. Reckoning, regret. Donald J. Trump entered precisely at 11:13 a.m., flanked by 2 advisors, a lawyer, a chosen Fox anchor, and a staffer who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. He walked like a man arriving to reclaim a throne. Charcoal suit, blood-red tie, American flag pin gleaming like a dare. He didn't acknowledge anyone, not even the committee chair. He went straight to the seat reserved for witnesses and sat down like the cameras had been waiting for him, not the other way around. Across from him, Harrison Ford was already seated. No entourage, no PR handler, no script, just a worn Navy shirt, a flight jacket, and a pair of hands folded in front of him like a pilot waiting on clearance. He hadn't spoken yet. He hadn't needed to. His presence was enough. The cameras knew who he was. America knew who he was. But in this room, he was treated like a relic, a museum piece brought in for nostalgia, until he looked up. Chairwoman Grant cleared her throat. The hearing was called to order. Ford was introduced as a civilian invited to testify on the real-world implications of the proposed budget cuts. 10 rescue missions, 2 confirmed saves, 6 medical evacuations, all flown by him, all unpaid, all unpublicized. Trump interrupted before Ford could finish his first sentence. "Let me get this straight," he said, leaning forward, voice loud enough to spike every mic. "We brought in a man who pretended to be a pilot in a movie 40 years ago. No law degree, no office, just a leather jacket and a film resume. To advise the United States government on national rescue funding." Ford didn't answer. He looked at the man talking, not like he was offended, but like he'd heard it before. Then slowly, he reached for the metal tag on the table and turned it toward the committee. It glinted under the overhead lights. A string of faded numbers etched deep into its surface. Latitude, longitude, aircraft registration, nothing more. Trump stared at it, just long enough to betray something he shouldn't have. Then he snapped. "Get him out." The room jolted. 2 Capitol officers stepped forward from opposite walls. Ford didn't rise, he didn't protest. He just looked down at the tag, then up at the committee, then finally at Trump. His voice was low, dry, almost too soft for the mic. "Before you throw me out, you might want to ask yourselves who pulled your sons out of the Idaho snow in '93. Every spine in the room stiffened, every mouth held shut. The tag sat on the table, dull, quiet, permanent. And on the far side of the chamber, one young congresswoman clenched the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Because she remembered. No one moved. The room didn't stir, didn't cough, didn't even blink. Harrison Ford's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished, but still smoldering beneath the floorboards. The committee chair leaned back ever so slightly. One aide near the corner scribbled something, then stopped mid-letter. And 3 seats down from Donald Trump, Congressman Martin Reynolds turned a shade paler. His jaw tightened. His fingers tapped twice, then curled into fists. Ford didn't turn toward him. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Instead, with the same calm that once steadied his hand at 8,000 feet above a snowstorm, Ford reached into his leather satchel and retrieved a battered manila envelope. It was worn at the corners, sealed with yellowed tape, and marked in faded ink, "Incident File Eastern Idaho 1993 Non-Public Release." He slid it across the polished mahogany. One slow motion, one quiet rebellion. Chairwoman Grant leaned forward. "Mr. Ford," she said, "what exactly is that?" "A memory," he replied, "one that was buried. One I was told never to mention, but I was also told the truth matters in this room. So let's test that theory." He broke the seal. The tape cracked like old ice. Inside, a thick photocopy of an original government report, stamped in bold at the top, "Department of Interior Search and Rescue Command Restricted File." On the 3rd page, near the middle in a typed incident log, the name appeared. Joshua William Reynolds, age 17, recovered alive. severe hypothermia, transported via civilian aircraft. Across the aisle, Congressman Reynolds exhaled hard through his nose, but still didn't speak. Ford looked down at the paper like he was seeing it for the first time, though the creases in the pages suggested otherwise. He slid the document under the overhead scanner. The monitors around the room flared to life. The name, the date, coordinates, everything suddenly real, undeniable, glowing in white against the black void of political denial. The footage came next. Without cue or drama, Ford reached for a USB drive. He handed it to the clerk. No explanation, no fanfare, just a nod. The screen flickered. Grainy video filled the chamber. A helmet cam from inside a Bell 407 helicopter. Whiteout conditions. Alarms shrieking. Ford's voice in the background, steady and clipped. Relaying coordinates to a dispatcher through broken signal. Approaching drop site. Snow unstable. We don't have long. The camera jolted as the aircraft dipped through a blizzard. Blades of pine trees blurred past. A figure emerged in the snow below, small, unmoving. Then the helicopter skidded low, nearly touching the ground. The side door opened. Ford stepped out, disappearing into the white. A pause. Then the screen showed him dragging a limp teenage boy through knee-deep snow toward the skids. The wind howled, visibility zero, but his grip never faltered. Josh W. Reynolds was airlifted out that day. He survived, he lived, but the footage never aired. The mission was never acknowledged. No press release, no medal, just a classified file and a non-disclosure agreement. Ford returned to the mic. I didn't speak about it because I was asked not to. I was told it could be politically inconvenient to make it public. That a civilian interfering in a rescue zone during a campaign cycle might be interpreted the wrong way. He paused. Let it settle, so I stayed quiet. He looked toward Trump, but quiet doesn't mean imaginary, and a leather jacket doesn't mean fiction. His voice didn't rise. It deepened. Worn, gravelly, grounded. I agreed to keep the story to myself. But I never agreed to sit here 30 years later and be called a pretend pilot by someone who's never lifted anything heavier than a microphone. Trump opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Across the room, Congressman Reynolds stared at the floor. His son, now a decorated wildlife conservationist, had never spoken about that rescue either. But every year on February 12th, he sent a handwritten card to an unlisted P.O. box in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. To the man who didn't ask for thanks, it always read, just for airspace. Chairwoman Grant cleared her throat. The video stopped. The screen faded to black. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence. It was heavier now, weighted with something undeniable. Ford reached for the metal tag still on the table. Same coordinates, he said simply. Same snow, same truth. And he sat back, folding his hands again, not in protest, not in pride, just the way a man sits when he spent half a lifetime waiting for someone else to tell the story. And no one ever did, so now he would. The silence hadn't moved. Even after the video faded and the last frame of snow-covered rescue flickered to black. The air in room 309 stayed tight, like something ancient had just been unearthed, and no one dared breathe too loudly around it. Harrison Ford didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The tag on the table still glinted faintly. The footage still echoed behind people's eyes. Then came the voice. Excuse me, soft, fragile, like it didn't want to interrupt but couldn't stay quiet anymore. A woman stood from the gallery 3 rows back, mid-30s. Gray slacks, hair pulled tight, no press badge, no party pin, just a public seat and a truth she'd carried long enough. May I speak? The chair hesitated, nodded. She stepped forward slowly, one hand at her side, the other already trembling. When she reached the rail, she didn't look at Trump. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at Ford. Sir, she said, her voice already shaking, we've never met, but I know your face. I remember it from 15 feet away, through broken glass and blood smoke. Her right hand reached across her body. She rolled up the sleeve of her blouse, exposing the underside of her forearm. A tattoo, small, precise, coordinates. The exact ones etched into the tag on Ford's table, and around them a ring of tiny pine trees. She didn't blink. That's the last place I thought I'd ever breathe. Murmurs rippled through the room. Phones stopped recording. Pens stopped moving. The hearing paused itself. I was a flight nurse, she continued. Part of a volunteer crew responding to evacuations near Shasta County. There was a man, 86 years old, trapped in his cabin, fire on 3 sides. The chopper sent to extract him never showed. We got the call and took off, even though airspace was restricted. She paused. We were hit by an updraft, lost tail control. The rotors clipped a tree line. The chamber held still. We dropped hard. She looked down, as if remembering how it felt to fall that fast. When I came to, my leg was broken. The pilot next to me was gone. The man in the back was gone. Fire was everywhere. And then her eyes lifted again. You, Ford didn't move. He sat still, as if frozen in some memory she was now opening for the room to see. You were bleeding, shoulder torn. You'd used your body to shield mine. I only realized it later when I saw the burn patterns on your jacket. You covered me when we hit. I'm alive because of that. A gasp, not loud, but real, and I never said thank you, because I was told not to, because the FAA labeled the mission off-book, because the paperwork vanished, and because the man who flew wasn't a contracted responder. He was a civilian, a retired actor, a liability. She swallowed hard. I wasn't allowed to mention your name, but I never forgot your voice. The silence that followed felt less like awe and more like shame. Chairwoman Grant leaned forward. Miss, would you be willing to identify yourself for the record? Her reply was clear. Emily Santos, former field nurse, Northern California Fire Response Unit, discharged 2016 due to injury sustained in the line of duty. Thank you, Ms. Santos, one reporter whispered, barely audible. Is this real? Ford finally turned, not to her, to the committee. They'll say I did it for attention or for press or politics. Then he turned to Emily. But you know why I was there? She nodded. The chair raised an eyebrow. Mr. Ford, why didn't you ever speak publicly about that crash, about what happened? Ford took a breath, the kind that reaches somewhere behind the ribs. Because what's right doesn't need applause. It needs repeating, especially when no one else will. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. It was just a sentence, carved like stone. Trump shifted in his seat, visibly irritated. He leaned toward the mic. So you want a medal for nearly dying? Ford's reply was almost a whisper. No, I want you to stop pretending I imagined it. Across the room, a staffer reached for a tissue. One aide to the chairman blinked rapidly and looked down. Emily Santos stayed where she stood, sleeves still rolled up, coordinates still exposed like a scar that remembered more than pain. Ford leaned back, hands still clasped, gaze resting somewhere far beyond the walls of Congress, like he was still in that falling chopper, still shielding someone who didn't have time to ask for help, still landing in silence because someone had to. And now, finally, someone else had spoken. Room hadn't recovered. Emily Santos's voice still lingered in the air, quieter now but present. A reminder that some stories survive even when the cameras forget to follow them. Harrison Ford hadn't moved. His hands remained folded, his expression unchanged. But something in the room had shifted. Respect, no, not yet, something deeper, unease. Trump leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight, as if silence was beginning to feel like defeat. He hadn't lost but he was no longer the loudest thing in the room. Then Ford moved, not dramatically, not with performance, just a slow, deliberate motion of his hand reaching back into that leather satchel. No one blinked. No one dared. He pulled out a flat black folder frayed at the spine, no government seal, just a folded piece of cream paper, carefully preserved in a thin sleeve. He didn't lift it right away. He looked at the chair. May I add something to the record? Chairwoman Grant nodded. Please proceed. Ford opened the sleeve, removed the page, and placed it under the overhead scanner. The monitors lit up again. At the top, a letterhead, The White House, dated February 2017. Midway down, the familiar signature of Barack Obama and a note handwritten below the formal message, in blue ink, slanted forward with purpose. You chose what was right over what was shiny. That's always the harder path. Thank you for walking it. Underneath, in more distinct handwriting, a second line. You chose right over recognition. And at the bottom corner, a final sentence circled twice. You chose truth over a medal. The chamber rippled. Ford looked to the committee. That letter was sent after I declined the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I was offered it under one condition, that I refrain from making any future statements critical of federal environmental deregulation policies, specifically the ones signed under this administration. He didn't look at Trump, not yet. I was told it was standard, that award ceremonies should be about celebration, not controversy. I was advised to keep certain views. Off the podium, a few heads turned toward the Republican side of the aisle. One aide whispered behind a hand. Ford continued, I don't blame anyone for offering it, but I knew what it meant. I could have had the honor, the applause, the legacy. He paused just long enough, but the silence they wanted in return cost too much. Now he turned to Trump. You see, I've been quiet before. I've been asked to stay quiet before, but not for this long, not while lives burned, not while rescue programs got slashed, not while forests vanished and facts got twisted like kindling. Trump shifted, scoffed audibly. Ford didn't blink. You didn't want my voice because it wasn't convenient, because I wasn't reading from the same script, because I was the man who had been there when you were still sending tweets from the comfort of a golf course. A stir moved through the gallery, not outrage, Recognition. That's enough, Trump muttered, leaning toward the mic. But before he could speak, a new voice cut in. I'd like to verify that letter. All eyes turned. A woman in the press gallery stood up. No network badge, just a tan blazer and a press credential from a name no one had seen on television in years. Marin Hayes, freelance investigative journalist. I was the first to hear about the letter, and the first to try publishing it. The room leaned forward. I reached out to multiple outlets. I had confirmation from staffers close to the correspondence office. I had 2 independent verifications, but no one wanted to run it. They said it was unverifiable, that the politics were too messy, that Ford's silence was proof the story wasn't real. She looked toward him. They didn't understand that his silence wasn't absence, it was discipline, and then her voice dropped. But it wasn't just editors. I received warnings, calls from blocked numbers. One night, a man showed up outside my apartment. He left nothing but a note. Don't resurrect ghosts that were buried for a reason. She held up a photo of the note, printed, time-stamped. Capitol Security checked it. It wasn't fake. Ford looked toward her, not with surprise, with something closer to quiet apology. I'm sorry you were dragged into it. She shook her head. I wasn't dragged, I followed. And now the room fell still again, because the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was living, breathing, whispering across the carpet of the chamber. Trump finally leaned in. So what? You turned down a medal and some blogger got spooked. You think that makes you a hero? Ford's response was almost too soft. No, I think it makes me someone you underestimated. And I think the truth you tried to bury still has dirt under its fingernails. The monitors stayed on. The letter glowed like it was still warm. And in that moment, Harrison Ford didn't look like a movie star, or a witness, or a man being questioned. He looked like the one person in the room who had already survived the kind of silence no one else was willing to break. Harrison Ford stepped back from the mic. He didn't say he was finished. He didn't need to. The words had already landed, and the room had no more room left for denial. He let his fingers brush over the edge of the letter still glowing on the screen behind him, then turned slightly toward his chair. One hand on the backrest, the other resting at his side like a man ready to walk away, not from the fight but from the noise. That's when it happened, a small voice, not amplified, not meant for the room, but somehow it cut through the marble silence better than any speech. Excuse me. Heads turned slowly, carefully. The noise didn't rise, it receded, because no one expected to see her. A girl no more than 12, shoes scuffed, hair braided, a too big sweater slipping off one shoulder. He stepped out from the far left corner of the public gallery, clutching a piece of paper in both hands, folded so many times it looked like it had survived a lifetime of being carried and refolded again and again. No security stopped her. No aide moved, not because she had permission, because something about her presence told everyone this was not the kind of voice you silenced. She walked, timid at first, then steadier, past journalists, past the railing, past history, until she stood just a few feet from Harrison Ford. He didn't speak. He just turned and lowered himself to one knee, not ceremoniously, not for the cameras, just enough to be eye level with someone who clearly had something to say but wasn't sure if she should say it. She unfolded the paper, a drawing. Crayon, rough lines, orange flames, a small house, a figure holding another by the hand, no facial details, just motion, blue sky, gray smoke, green trees burning at the edges. She held it out, her hands trembling. I don't remember your face, she said softly, but my mom said I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. No one moved. The little girl blinked fast, the way people do when they're holding back a dam with a thread. She told me that a long time ago. Before I was born, you flew into a fire to save my grandma. In Montana, everyone else had pulled out, said the winds were too high, but you didn't. Ford didn't respond. His face said more than words could. She sniffled once, rubbed her sleeve across her nose. My grandma died 2 years ago, but she made my mom promise to tell me. And my mom told me that when she was pregnant with me, she used to talk to me in her belly. She said she told me the story of you. She said she hoped I'd grow up brave like that. Ford slowly reached out and rested his hand gently on the girl's shoulder. Not a gesture for the room, a gesture for her. She looked down at her drawing. I thought you were just a story. She looked up again. But then I saw the metal tag on your necklace. My mom has the same numbers written in a book. She said that was where you landed. The chamber, once bursting with politics, now held only breath. And she added, voice thinner now, she always said heroes are the people who show up when nobody's watching. Ford swallowed. He looked down at the drawing. He traced one corner with a calloused finger. She asked, quiet but clear, why weren't you ever on TV? He exhaled through his nose, smiled softly, because some stories aren't supposed to be about who gets seen. They are about who gets saved. She nodded, then said something no one was prepared for. My mom said if I ever met you, I should say thank you, not just for saving Grandma, but for not turning it into a movie. Ford chuckled once, just enough to break the tension without shattering it. He turned to the chairwoman, then to the cameras, then back to the girl. She held up the drawing again. Do you want to keep it? He took it with both hands, looked at it like it was gold leaf and fire, then folded it once carefully and slipped it into the pocket above his heart. That image, his hand on her shoulder, her drawing tucked into his chest, was what the networks chose. It was the photo that ran in the morning papers. It was the looped segment that aired on screens across the country, not his speech, not the letter, not the scandal, that, the girl, the drawing, the man who didn't chase applause but caught something deeper. And in towns across the country, people paused mid-coffee, mid-errand, mid-scroll, because for one quiet second the truth didn't shout. It held a child's hand, and the nation listened. The moment should have stayed quiet, should have ended with the drawing pressed to Ford's chest and the echo of a child's thank you still warm in the room. But silence unsettles men who thrive on noise. Trump stood, not slowly, not strategically. He rose like someone who felt control slipping and thought volume could pull it back. Enough. His voice cracked through the chamber like a gunshot in a cathedral. This is a circus. A stunt. You've spent the better part of an hour listening to a washed-up actor peddle war stories and bedtime tales for sympathy. This man, he pointed, not subtly, isn't a witness. He's a nostalgia campaign, a man clinging to his jacket and a decade no one remembers. He didn't pause for effect. He didn't need to. The fury was its own punctuation. You want to make him a hero because he flew a few helicopters, because he cried with a kid. Let me tell you what he is. He's a man who got old and missed the cameras, a man who couldn't accept being forgotten. So now he's here, turning a policy hearing into a movie script. He turned to the committee, and you're letting him. Somewhere in the back row, a pencil snapped in someone's hand. No one looked up. Ford didn't react, not a blink, not a shift. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked, weathered, held together by 2 decades of fingerprints and smoke. He placed it gently on the table, unsnapped the clasp, flipped to the final page. No preamble, no announcement. He slid the book under the document camera. The screen lit up. 1 page, 1 sentence. Handwritten in dark ink, bold and deliberate. Silence lets power lie. I've flown through worse storms. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. A beat passed, then another, and then a second voice entered the room. This one calmer, quieter, the kind of voice that carried because it didn't try to. Marla Dean, investigative reporter with Western Ledger. She rose from the press gallery, holding a document in her hand. For the record, she said, that man sitting there donated over $2 million of his own film earnings over the last 5 years to a wildfire survivor fund. The same fund this administration cut federal support for in 2019. She held up the sheet, no fanfare, just numbers. His donations weren't publicized. They were processed through a trust, quietly, without press, without ceremony. The fund paid for emergency housing, counseling, medical flights. She looked toward Trump. It paid for the kind of rescues your budget cuts left stranded. Trump scoffed, loud, dismissive. Oh, please, you think throwing money around makes him righteous? That's not policy, that's ego with a bank account. Ford spoke. The voice came low, precise, stripped of warmth. I'm not here to argue policy. He turned slowly until his gaze found Trump. I'm here to ask a simpler question. His eyes didn't blink. His tone didn't rise. If human lives aren't worth acknowledging, what is? The room didn't breathe. Trump opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Ford continued. If you can stand behind a podium and talk about greatness, but refuse to look at the faces of the people burned, broken, buried under the weight of budget lines you signed, then what exactly are you measuring? He looked down, tapped once on the page. This isn't performance, it's a mirror, and you don't like what you see. No one moved. The cameras stayed locked on him, not because they were told to, but because the lens understood something the microphones hadn't caught yet. Truth had just shifted form. It wasn't wrapped in speeches or applause. It wore smoke in its seams and ash in its fingerprints, and it didn't shout. It just stood there still while power lost its footing. Harrison Ford turned toward the door, not with defiance, not with drama, just a slow, steady pivot. Like a man who knew when his presence had spoken louder than his voice ever could. The notebook still lay open behind him, the words lit across the overhead screen like a quiet verdict. The chamber didn't breathe as he moved, boots pressing gently against the marble, coat swinging lightly with each deliberate step. He reached the threshold, and then the screen above the chairman's seat blinked once, then again. Motion to compel passed. Witness under subpoena. A low, synchronized chime echoed through the chamber as the vote finalized. Numbers turned green. The resolution locked. The room didn't cheer, it froze. Trump turned sharply, eyes darting toward the screen, then toward the staffers behind him. His lips parted, but no sound came. He looked disoriented, like someone who had just been told the ground beneath him was not ground at all. Ford paused, not in resistance, in consideration. Then he turned around, calmly, fully, hands by his sides. He looked at Trump not as an accuser, not as an adversary, but as a man looking at the final reflection in a mirror cracked too long to ignore. "You used to command attention with a tweet," he said. Just a few words. People jumped. The news shifted. Fear did the rest. He walked forward, each step as quiet as the truth he had carried for decades. But now I only needed one story. He turned slightly toward the cameras, now glowing red, every network dialed in. Just one. He didn't raise his voice. "I don't need to win." He looked directly into the lens. "I just need to remind people that silence does not always mean agreement." He paused, let the words sit. Some of us, we weren't quiet because we were complicit. We were quiet because we were waiting for the right storm, the one worth flying through, and I think we just found it. He stepped back, that was all. There was no gavel, no chant, no applause, but slowly, deliberately, the room began to rise. First a senator, then a representative, then a clerk, then a staffer. No one spoke, no one needed to. They stood because something had moved them, something older than politics, older than headlines. They stood for a man who never asked to be honored, a man who carried the weight of his silence until it became the only language left that people trusted. Trump remained seated, still, silent, not in control, watching the power shift without fanfare. Ford turned one last time, hand resting on the edge of the table. "I've flown through worse storms," he said again, "but this one was worth landing for." And with that he walked out, not under guard, not under protest, just a man who had stayed silent long enough, and finally chose to speak. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.